I will defend him! The words didn't just echo, they cracked through the courtroom like a sudden thunderclap, sharp enough to stop every whisper mid-breath as heads turned in perfect unison toward the back row where a black maid stood, her posture straight, her uniform still faintly smelling of lemon polish and marble dust. Her hands no longer moving but resting still at her sides as if she had been waiting her entire life for this exact moment, while 30 feet away, under the cold glow of recessed ceiling lights, Richard Hale, billionaire, titan, a man who had once filled rooms with quiet authority, sat alone at the defense table, his chair suddenly too large, his presence diminished not by chains or force but by absence, because his attorney had just walked out, briefcase in hand, leaving behind nothing but a hollow echo of footsteps and a case that was seconds away from collapsing in front of a packed courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood, paper and tension, the judge leaning forward with narrowed eyes, fingers pressed together in measured patience, the prosecutor adjusting his cufflinks with a subtle smile that never reached his eyes, already tasting victory, already imagining headlines, and somewhere in the gallery a low murmur began to rise, disbelief mixed with something colder, sharper, the kind of quiet judgment that spreads faster than truth, because to them she was just a cleaner. Someone who wiped fingerprints off glass doors and emptied trash bins after hours, someone invisible. Until she wasn't, and now she had stepped into a space where she was never meant to exist, let alone speak, yet Maya Williams didn't hesitate, didn't look around for permission, didn't shrink beneath the weight of 100 stares pressing into her skin like heat from stage lights. Instead she took one step forward, then another, the soft rubber sole of her shoe tapping against polished floor in a rhythm that cut clean through the silence. And when she reached the open space between rows her voice came again, steadier this time, lower but unshaken. He deserves a defense. And something in the room shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm changes direction, because it wasn't just what she said, it was how she stood, how her eyes didn't flicker, how her breath remained even while everything around her teetered on the edge of collapse, and for the briefest second, Richard Hale looked at her, really looked, not as staff, not as background, but as something else entirely, something unfamiliar, something he couldn't immediately define, and that uncertainty, that flicker of doubt in a man who had built his life on certainty, was the first crack in a narrative everyone thought was already written. The judge did not respond right away, and that silence stretched long enough to make the air feel heavier, pressing down on every shoulder in the room as if even the walls were waiting to see how far this would go, and then, slowly, he adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Maya, not with approval but with measured curiosity. The kind reserved for something unexpected that could either collapse or completely change the course of what was unfolding. "Young lady," he said carefully, his voice calm but edged with doubt. "This is a federal courtroom, not a place for interruptions." And a few quiet chuckles slipped from the gallery, quickly swallowed as Maya took another step forward, her gaze steady, her voice clear. "I understand, Your Honor, but he does not have representation, and without it, this is not a fair proceeding." And the words did not sound rehearsed, they did not sound hopeful, they sounded certain, like something rooted deeper than courage, something built from years of watching, learning, absorbing every detail from the shadows where no one thought she was paying attention, and the prosecutor shifted in his seat, the faint smile on his face tightening just slightly as he leaned forward, tapping a pen against the table with controlled impatience. "With all due respect," he said, his tone smooth but dismissive, "this is highly irregular, she is not part of the legal team, she is not even—" He paused just long enough for the word to land sharper. "Qualified." And a ripple of agreement moved through the room like a quiet wave. But Maya did not turn toward him, did not acknowledge the word meant to reduce her, instead she kept her focus on the judge. "I am asking for permission to speak on his behalf, not as an attorney of record, but to present what has been overlooked." And that phrase lingered, overlooked, because in a room filled with professionals, experts, and people paid to notice everything, the idea that something had been missed was more unsettling than her presence itself, and for a moment the judge leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the bench, weighing not just her request but the risk of allowing it, the possibility that this was either a disruption or something far more significant, and across the room Richard Hale exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if he was not sure whether to stop her or listen, because nothing about this made sense, not the timing, not the person, not the quiet certainty in her voice that did not match the uniform she wore. And then, just as the silence threatened to close the door on her entirely, the judge spoke again. "You have 2 minutes." And the words landed like a small fracture in the rigid structure of the courtroom, just enough to let something through, and the prosecutor leaned back with a faint, confident smile returning, as if 2 minutes would only prove what everyone already believed. But Maya did not rush, did not scramble. Instead she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a folded piece of paper, edges worn, corners softened from being opened and closed too many times, and as she placed it gently on the table, smoothing it with steady fingers, something shifted again, quieter this time, but deeper, because this was no longer about interruption, this was about intention, and when she finally looked up, her eyes moved not to the judge, not to the prosecutor, but to the evidence laid out in front of them all, and in that moment it became clear that she had not stepped forward on impulse. She had been preparing for this long before anyone noticed she was even in the room. The paper made a soft sound as it touched the polished surface, almost too quiet to matter, yet every eye in the courtroom dropped to it as if it carried more weight than the stacks of binders already submitted into evidence, and Maya did not rush to speak. She let that moment settle, let the silence do its work, because she understood something most people in that room did not, that attention is not taken, it is guided. And when she finally lifted her hand and pointed to a specific line, her voice followed, calm and precise. "This transaction timestamp does not match the system log." And a faint crease formed between the prosecutor's brows, subtle but real, as he leaned forward, scanning the document with a confidence that had not yet been shaken. "It has already been verified," he replied, his tone clipped, dismissive, but not as steady as before, and Maya nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, as if she had expected that response. "Verified by the summary report," she said, her finger still resting on the page. "But not by the raw log entries." And that distinction, small and technical, slipped through the air like a thin crack in glass, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, and the judge leaned slightly forward now, his interest no longer passive. "Explain," he said, and Maya did, not with speed, not with hesitation, but with clarity that felt practiced, earned in long hours no one had witnessed. "The summary compresses activity into grouped intervals, but the raw logs show individual entries, down to the second, and if you look here." She shifted the paper slightly, aligning it with another document already submitted. "The transaction is recorded at 2:14 p.m., but the server maintenance log shows the system was in a restricted state from 2:10 to 2:20, which means no external transactions could have been processed during that window." And this time the silence that followed was different, heavier, because it was no longer built on doubt of her, it was built on uncertainty of everything else, and the prosecutor's pen stopped tapping, his fingers tightening slightly around it as he flipped through his own files, faster now, less composed, while across the table Richard Hale sat still, his eyes fixed not on the judge, not on the opposing counsel, but on Maya, as if trying to understand how someone who had been invisible moments ago was now holding the entire case at a standstill, and the judge turned a page himself, scanning, comparing, his expression shifting in small increments, not dramatic, but undeniable. "Counsel," he said, addressing the prosecutor without looking up, "was this discrepancy addressed in your filings?" And the pause that followed that question stretched just long enough to change the balance of the room, because the answer did not come immediately, and in that delay, in that single hesitation, something fundamental shifted. The certainty that had filled the courtroom at the beginning of the hearing began to thin, replaced by something quieter, more dangerous, the possibility that the outcome was not as inevitable as it had seemed, and Maya did not smile, did not look around to measure reactions. She simply stood there, steady, grounded, as if she had already stepped beyond the need to be believed and into the responsibility of being right, and for the first time since the trial began, the room was not watching a billionaire on the edge of losing everything, it was watching a truth slowly, deliberately come into focus. The hesitation did not go unnoticed. It spread quietly through the courtroom like a shift in air pressure before a storm, subtle but undeniable, and the prosecutor straightened in his chair, clearing his throat as if to reclaim control of a moment that was slipping too far from his grasp. "The summary report consolidates verified data," he said, choosing his words carefully now, each one placed with more caution than confidence. But Maya did not interrupt. She waited, letting him finish. Letting the room hear the explanation fully before she spoke again, because she understood that truth lands harder when it is not rushed. "Then the summary is incomplete," she replied, her tone not sharp, not confrontational, but firm in a way that left no room for dismissal, and a few heads turned again, not toward her position in the room, but toward the meaning of her words, and the judge's pen moved for the first time, a small note written in the margin of a document that moments ago had seemed final. "On what basis do you make that claim?" he asked, his voice steady but no longer distant, and Maya inhaled slowly, just once, grounding herself before answering. "Because I have seen this system before," she said, and that sentence carried more weight than anything she had said so far, not because of volume, but because of implication, and the prosecutor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Seen it where?" he pressed, and for the first time, Maya's gaze shifted, not away, but inward, as if she was pulling something from a place she had kept carefully guarded. "During night shifts," she said. "When maintenance logs are printed before archiving, the summaries are generated automatically, but the raw logs are stored separately, and if there is a discrepancy, it means something was either filtered or misinterpreted." And the room absorbed that slowly, piece by piece, because it was no longer just a claim. It was a process, something tangible, something that could be checked, verified, challenged, and across the table Richard Hale leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting on the edge of the defense table, the first physical sign that he was no longer a passive observer in his own case, while the prosecutor flipped another page, then another, faster now, searching for something that would restore the certainty he had walked in with. But the rhythm had changed, the control had shifted, and even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed louder in the pause that followed. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began again, but this time there was a trace of urgency beneath the professionalism. "We cannot allow unverified interpretations from non-qualified individuals to derail proceedings." And the word non-qualified landed again, but it did not carry the same weight it had before, not after what the room had just witnessed, and the judge did not immediately agree, did not nod, did not dismiss her. Instead he looked at the documents in front of him, then at Maya, then back again, as if recalibrating the framework he had been using to evaluate everything up to this point, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. "If what she is suggesting is accurate, then the integrity of this evidence must be examined further." And that was it, not a ruling, not a declaration, but enough to shift the ground beneath everyone's feet, and Maya did not react outwardly, did not show relief or triumph. She simply stood there, steady as before, because for her this was never about proving herself to the room, it was about holding on to something that existed beyond the room entirely, something that did not change based on who was speaking or who was listening, and as the judge requested a brief review of the submitted logs, the silence returned once more, but this time it was not filled with doubt about her. It was filled with a growing realization that the case, the narrative, and the outcome were no longer as certain as they had been just minutes ago. The courtroom did not erupt, it tightened, like a held breath that refused to release, and the judge's request for review did not bring relief, it brought pressure, the kind that settles deep in the chest and lingers, because now every second mattered, every detail was being re-examined under a sharper lens, and the prosecutor rose slowly from his seat, smoothing the front of his suit as if regaining physical control could restore the authority that had just slipped. "Your Honor," he said, his voice measured but carrying a new edge, "this line of argument is speculative at best, and dangerously misleading at worst." And he turned, not fully toward Maya, but enough to acknowledge her presence without granting her equal standing. "We are discussing complex financial systems, not something that can be interpreted from casual observation." And a few nods followed, quieter now, less certain, but still present, and Maya remained still, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, her fingers no longer touching the paper but close enough to return to it if needed, and she did not respond immediately, because she understood something he did not, that rushing to defend yourself can sometimes weaken the truth you are trying to protect, and the judge looked between them, weighing again, recalibrating again, the balance shifting but not yet settled. "Do you have anything further to support your claim?" he asked, and this time the question carried expectation, not dismissal, and Maya nodded once, a small movement, controlled, deliberate. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, and her voice did not rise, did not push, it remained steady, grounded. "If the system was restricted during that window, then any transaction recorded at that time would have required an override, and overrides are logged separately." And she paused, just long enough for the implication to form in the minds of everyone listening. "There is no override log submitted with this evidence." And that absence landed heavier than any accusation, because it was not about what was present, it was about what was missing, and the prosecutor's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers pressing against the table as he leaned forward. "The absence of a log does not imply wrongdoing," he replied, but there was a fraction of hesitation now, a fraction that had not existed before, and Maya did not challenge him directly, she did not raise her voice or step closer, instead she simply said, "It implies incompleteness." And that word, again, settled into the room, not as an attack, but as a fact waiting to be addressed, and across the table Richard Hale shifted for the first time in minutes, his chair making a faint sound against the floor, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion of her, but in recognition of something he had not considered, something his own legal team had not shown him, and the judge turned another page, then another, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each document carried new weight. "Counsel," he said again, looking toward the prosecutor, "were all system logs submitted in full?" And the question did not echo, it settled, and the silence that followed it was no longer passive, it was active, expectant, pressing forward, and the prosecutor opened his mouth, then paused, just for a second, but that second stretched, because everyone saw it, everyone felt it, and in that pause, the narrative that had once seemed fixed began to loosen further, threads unraveling one by one, not with force, but with precision, and Maya stood exactly where she had been, not moving, not reacting. Because for her the tension was not something to escape, it was something to hold, something to let unfold naturally, and as the courtroom waited for an answer that did not come as quickly as it should have, it became clear that this was no longer a moment of interruption, it was a moment of exposure, and nothing in the room felt as certain as it had just minutes before. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into the space like a weight no one could ignore, and for a moment even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder, filling the gaps where certainty used to live, and Maya did not move, not even slightly, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, as if she had stepped into a place beyond urgency, a place where time slowed just enough for truth to surface on its own. And across from her the prosecutor finally looked down at his documents. Again, but this time it was not with confidence, it was with scrutiny, flipping pages more carefully, slower, as if something he had once trusted now required verification, and that shift, quiet as it was, carried through the room, because when certainty hesitates, everyone feels it, and the judge leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the bench, no longer pressing forward but no longer dismissive either. Suspended between two possibilities that no longer felt equal, and near the defense table Richard Hale exhaled, long and controlled, his gaze lowering to the surface of the table, not in defeat, but in thought, as if something Maya had said had reached further than the case itself, further than the documents or the numbers, and for a brief moment his eyes softened, not toward her directly, but toward the space between them, where something unspoken had begun to form, a recognition that did not need words, and Maya felt it, not as validation, but as a quiet shift in the atmosphere, the kind that comes when people begin to see what they had overlooked, and she allowed herself one small breath, deeper than the others, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, feeling the cool surface beneath her skin, grounding herself in the present, because she knew this moment was not about proving anything anymore, It was about holding steady while everything else adjusted, and somewhere in the gallery a chair shifted, a faint creak that echoed softly, reminding everyone that they were still inside a room, still inside a system that had not yet decided how to respond, and the judge's eyes moved once more between the documents and the people before him, slower now, more deliberate, as if each detail carried weight that could not be rushed, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, less rigid. "We will take a brief pause to review the submitted materials." And that decision did not resolve anything, it did not declare victory or defeat, but it opened space, and in that space something changed, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably, because for the first time since the proceedings began, the outcome was no longer fixed in the minds of those watching, and as the room remained still, suspended in that quiet uncertainty, Maya did not step back, did not retreat into the background she had come from. She remained exactly where she was, present, grounded, and unshaken. As if she understood that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is not to push forward, but to stand still long enough for the truth to catch up. When the courtroom reconvened, nothing looked different, but everything felt altered, like the air itself had shifted weight, and the judge returned to his seat with a stack of reviewed documents placed carefully before him, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each page carried consequences that could not be rushed, and the prosecutor stood again, but this time without the quiet confidence he had worn so easily before, his posture still upright, his tone still controlled, but something beneath it had changed, something less certain, and Maya remained where she had been, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her presence no longer an interruption but a point of focus, and the judge adjusted his glasses once more before speaking, his voice steady but no longer detached. "The court has reviewed the submitted summary reports alongside the system maintenance logs," he said, and a faint stillness spread again, deeper than before, because now the room understood that this was no longer about speculation, it was about confirmation. "There is a discrepancy," he continued, and that single sentence did not echo, it settled, heavy and precise, and the prosecutor's jaw tightened as he stepped forward. "Your Honor, if I may." But the judge raised a hand slightly, not abruptly, not forcefully, but enough to pause him, enough to hold the moment where it needed to stay. "The recorded transaction falls within a restricted system window," the judge went on, his eyes moving briefly toward Maya before returning to the documents. "And no override log has been provided to justify its occurrence." And that absence, now spoken aloud, carried more weight than any argument that had been made earlier, because it was no longer a claim, it was a fact acknowledged by the court itself. And a quiet ripple moved through the gallery, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, the sound of expectations shifting, of conclusions being reconsidered in real time, and across the room Richard Hale sat motionless, his eyes fixed forward, but something in his expression had changed, not relief, not yet, but recognition, as if he was seeing not just the case unraveling in a different direction, but the person who had redirected it, and Maya did not react outwardly, did not allow the shift in the room to pull her out of the stillness she had maintained, because for her this moment was not about being right, it was about what came next, and the prosecutor, now without the advantage he had started with, took a breath before speaking again. "The absence of an override log does not eliminate the possibility of manual input," he said, reaching for ground that felt less stable with each word, and Maya finally turned slightly, not fully toward him, but enough to be heard clearly. "Manual inputs are also logged," she said, her voice calm, unwavering, and that sentence landed cleanly, without force, without emphasis, but with finality, and for a brief moment no one spoke, because there was nothing immediate left to counter, nothing simple to dismiss, and the judge's pen moved again, another note, another mark in a process that was no longer following its original path. "Based on this inconsistency," the judge said after a measured pause, "the court cannot accept the current evidence as complete." And that statement did not resolve the case, but it shifted its foundation entirely, and in that shift, something irreversible had occurred, because the narrative that had once placed Richard Hale at the center of an inevitable outcome had been interrupted, redirected, and re-examined, not by a team of experts, not by a strategy prepared in advance, but by someone who had been overlooked until the moment she chose not to be, and as the courtroom settled into this new reality, quieter now, more uncertain, Maya remained still, her presence no longer questioned, her voice no longer dismissed, and for the first time since she had spoken, the room was not asking who she was, but how they had failed to see her sooner. The shift did not come with applause or raised voices, it came quietly, in the way people stopped leaning back and started leaning in the way the prosecutor no longer spoke first, and in the way the judge's attention returned, not to the polished arguments prepared in advance, but to the space Maya now occupied, steady and unyielding, and for a moment no one moved. As if the room itself needed time to adjust to a truth that had already taken root, and then the judge closed the file in front of him with a soft, deliberate motion. "Given the inconsistencies presented," he said, his voice firm but measured, "this court will suspend reliance on the current evidence until further verification is completed." And that decision did not end the case, but it removed its certainty, and in doing so, it removed the pressure that had been closing in around the defense table, and across from him the prosecutor nodded once, slowly, not in agreement but in acceptance of a position that could no longer be argued in the same way, and he gathered his documents with more care than before, each movement controlled, contained, as if aware that every action was now being observed through a different lens, and Richard Hale remained seated, his posture still composed, but the tension that had once held his shoulders rigid had softened, not completely, but enough to reveal something underneath, something closer to reflection than resistance. And after a brief pause he turned his head slightly toward Maya, not fully, not directly, but enough for his voice to reach her without carrying across the entire room. "You did not have to do that," he said quietly, and the words did not carry entitlement, they carried something unfamiliar to him, something closer to humility, and Maya did not respond immediately, she did not step closer or change her posture, she simply let the moment settle before answering, her voice just as calm as before. "That is not how fairness works," she said, and there was no judgment in her tone, no reference to what he had done or who he had been, only a statement that stood on its own, and Richard's gaze lowered for a brief second, as if that sentence had reached somewhere deeper than the case, somewhere he had not expected to confront, and then he nodded once, a small motion, almost imperceptible, but real, and when he looked up again, there was no attempt to respond, no argument. Just a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken aloud, and around them the courtroom began to move again, slowly returning to its structure, chairs shifting, papers being collected, the low murmur of voices returning, but something had changed within that movement, something subtle but lasting, because the room no longer saw Maya as someone who had stepped out of place, they saw her as someone who had revealed a gap in a system they trusted without question. And as she reached down to pick up the folded paper she had brought with her, smoothing its edges once more before placing it back into her apron pocket, her hands moved with the same quiet precision they had always had, unchanged by the weight of what had just happened, and for a brief moment she glanced toward the bench, then toward the door, as if measuring where she belonged next, and without waiting for recognition, without expecting acknowledgement, she turned and began to walk back toward the same space she had come from, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, steady, unhurried, leaving behind not a statement, not a victory, but something far more difficult to ignore, the undeniable presence of someone who had chosen to stand for something that did not depend on status, power, or permission. The hallway outside the courtroom felt different, quieter, as if the weight of what had just happened had not followed everyone out at the same pace, and Maya walked with the same steady rhythm she had carried inside, her steps soft against the polished floor, her reflection moving beside her in the tall glass panels that lined the corridor, unchanged, uncelebrated, and yet something in the air behind her lingered. Something that had not been there before, and she did not turn back, not because she could not, but because she did not need to, and as she reached the service door at the far end of the hall, the familiar scent of cleaning solution and cool air met her again, grounding, ordinary, a quiet contrast to the intensity she had just stepped through, and for a moment she paused, her hand resting lightly on the metal handle, her fingers still, her breath slow. As if allowing everything to settle into place without forcing meaning onto it, and behind her the distant sound of voices echoed faintly, lower now, less certain, and among them, one set of footsteps separated from the rest, measured, deliberate, approaching without urgency but without hesitation either, and Maya did not turn immediately, she simply listened, the rhythm of those steps becoming clearer as they closed the distance, until they stopped just a few feet behind her, and then a voice, quieter than before. Not carrying across a room but meant only for her. Maya! And she turned then, slowly, meeting Richard Hale's gaze in a space where titles did not matter, where the courtroom no longer defined them, and for a brief second neither of them spoke, because whatever had shifted between them did not need to be explained, it simply existed, present and undeniable, and Richard looked at her not with authority, not with expectation, but with something closer to understanding, something that had not been there when the day began. "You saw something no one else did," he said. And his voice carried no edge, no defense, just acknowledgement, and Maya held his gaze for a moment before answering, her expression calm, her tone even. "It was always there," she said, and the simplicity of her words left no space for argument, only reflection, and Richard nodded once, slower this time, as if the meaning reached further than the moment itself, and then he stepped back, not out of dismissal, but out of respect, giving her the space she had never been given before, and Maya turned again toward the door, her hand pressing it open with the same quiet motion, and as the door closed behind her, the sound was soft, almost unnoticeable, but it marked something complete, not in the sense of an ending, but in the sense of something that had come full circle without needing recognition to be real, and inside the corridor the light shifted slightly as the afternoon sun moved across the windows, casting long reflections along the floor, and for a brief moment, if anyone had been watching closely enough, they would have seen not just the cleaner returning to her routine, but the outline of something else, something stronger, something steady, something that had always been there, waiting not to be discovered, but to be seen.